Good morning. This is the 16th installment of this series. Right off the bat, I have a message for all you first-timers out there. Bye! Yes, if this is your first time, it really shouldn't be. Which is to say, I highly suggest you watch the original, the video entitled simply, The Woman with 1.5 Hands. Then watch part 2, and then part 3, part 4, like that. Soon, you'll be right back here. Anyway, here's part 16, or War. Emil Durkheim studied the effects of integration on suicide rates in other areas besides religion or the family. Up next, integration having to do with one's nation. First, how might one measure nation-oriented integration of a people who are citizens of the same nation? One way, Durkheim answered, is to watch what happens to suicide rates during war or Revolutionary War. He found that integrated citizens of a nation at war, no matter who attacked first, committed suicide at decidedly lower rates. Sidebar. War in 19th century Europe was quite a bit different than putting a ribbon on the bumper of one's SUV. Present during any European war, then, and you're facing very good odds of either being a soldier or their soldiers marching into your neighborhood, which is different than having a vague idea of soldiers from the good old US of A going over there somewhere. Yes, victims of 9/11 and families of soldiers who have been killed or maimed lately might not agree with what the statistical evidence tells us, but then again they might. So what is the statistical evidence? The U.S. population average over the last 12 years, about 300 million, divided by a slightly rounded figure of 9/11 casualties, 3,000, comes out to 0.001%, or 1/1000th of 1%. More in my notes. Anyway, war is definitely a different beast now, and so is Revolutionary War. During revolutions in the 19th century, suicide dropped 10%, and it did so immediately. War against other nations? Again, suicide dropped immediately, and from 13 to 18%. Of paramount import, though, for us, is the difference between their rural and urban rates. Paris, for instance, during France's 1848 Revolutionary War, saw suicide immediately drop 32%, stay that low throughout the war, and then rise to pre-war levels almost immediately after that war ended, which contrasts with the suicide rate of those in rural parts of France, which barely budged throughout this same sequence. This shows, Durkheim wrote, that when facing war, city folk quickly, but usually only temporarily, become more strongly integrated nationalistically, as differs from rural folk who already were plenty integrated, as evidenced by their peacetime suicide rates clocking in at about half that of those in the city. Example, here are the composite 19th century European suicide rates. All figures reflect instances per 100,000. During peace, urban at 20 per, rural at 10 per. During war, urban down to 13.6 per, and rural still hanging tough at about 10 per. More details in my notes. Durkheim reasoned that this difference is due in large part to farmers not reading urban newspapers and their word of mouth involving other farmers and having to do with seeds and steer and such. City dwellers, on the other hand, read each day in their newspapers about the calamity du jour, and they take it to heart. They take it personally, and to a measurable extent, i.e., their fluctuating suicide rates. When not at war, urbanites wear it on their faces and read it on the faces of others. Thus they transmit to each other news of the world's problems, and, to a certain extent, that others are responsible for these problems. Go to war and everything changes. Suddenly urbanites realize they're all on the same team. A fellow Frenchman, down on both his luck and the sidewalk, used to be considered a blight or a problem. well, he's no longer problematic. He can shoot a gun or load bullets into one or do something for the war effort. And it's not just that he can help in the war effort, he wants to help too. Quote, "This is no time to commit suicide. We all need each other. We are all each other's saviors." End quote. That's the message that city people write on their foreheads and send out with their expressions when war strikes. Instead of giving each other paper cuts, instead of contributing to another's death by 1,000 paper cuts, these temporarily strongly integrated citizens give each other attaboys and pat each other on the back, so to speak, and say things like, "Yes, our munitions factory is right around that corner. Here, let me give you a ride." Then they open up their buggy, and soon their nag feels the lash. But not only is war different now, especially for U.S. citizens, and about a century later, my most recent sidebar, urban/rural differences are also qualitatively different as well. Durkheim mentioned often how newspapers helped to spread what eventually is attributed to higher suicide rates of those who read these papers, namely city dwellers. Those city folk were aware of their national news, but not integrated nationalistically during peace. Sure, they were plugged in during both war and peace, but only during war did they become more strongly integrated. Fast forward. Who now in America has internet access, phone service that conceivably connects them to any phone in the world, radio, ham radio, TV, satellite TV, access to AP News, and more? Better question, who doesn't have at least one of those? It should be clear. We don't really have that many people here in the States who aren't plugged in, no matter where they reside. My point? Almost every living American, whether from the city or the country, is as plugged in to what ills this nation now as urban French denizens were to what illed France then. In other words, what protected the rural French from suicide then, not being as plugged in, isn't as protective now. And this applies to just about anybody in any first world nation, because we're all so much more plugged in. Living in the country might be less stressful than living in the city, but country folk today are still getting plenty of what is verifiably associated with higher suicide rates, if what Durkheim discovered years ago still holds true, and I think it does. Subtotaling, while considering the efficacy and applicability of Durkheimian principles in today's world, we can just about toss out his French national rates, even his European rates, and go with European urban rates only. In other words, war commences and suicide drops, say, 32%, like it did in Paris in 1848. That means that when there wasn't a war being fought locally, many more people just happened to end it all. Coincidence? Nope. These many more are extra suicides, or surplus suicides. If there were 100 suicides in a given demographic during peacetime, but then during war there were 68 suicides in that same demographic, Durkheim wrote that these 68 are so far from being integrated nationalistically that it would be pretty hard to talk very many of them out of killing themselves, no matter whether at war or at peace. But the other 32 can be reasoned with. They can become integrated. Somehow, though, during peace, because of not being integrated, ringleaders talk them into believing their nation would be better off without them. All we have to do is change their newspaper, wrote Durkheim, and these 32 extras won't kill themselves. Does changing their newspaper involve encouraging these 32 to be less patriotic? Not at all. One is actually being more patriotic by staying alive, because only alive people can load bullets into guns if needed for that next war. And to assume there won't be another war is whimsical. So, is this transferable? In my final video of this series, I delve into how labeling theory isn't just for 6-year-olds anymore, and I draw comparisons between it and Durkheim. He mentions city dwellers wearing news of the world on their faces and in their carriage and demeanor. We get and give those same news reports, so to speak, today, whether we're from the city or the country. We get and give both attaboys and paper cuts. If cumulative paper cuts are indeed the alterable component of the suicide equation, especially as it relates to those 32 surplus suicides, then yes, there is a similar way to eliminate upwards of 32 out of every 100 American rapes. Here, a YouTuber might ask, so your interpretation then of Durkheimian suicide prevention as it relates to rape prevention involves 1, these 32 women doing something different, followed by 2, as a direct result of them doing something different, they end up not being raped? Not at all. Okay, is this a plan for them to be Catholic instead of Protestant? For them to move to Tuscany, Italy, where it's warm and sultry, and to move away from the icy cold grip of those mean Germans? No. The Woman with 1.5 Hands is not about blaming women for their own rapes. And it isn't about saying that since they didn't move to Spain, Portugal, Ireland, or Italy, that they even partially caused their own rapes. Not at all. It's about stopping the ringleaders from talking those 32 potential rapists into raping. It's about changing the rape culture. Durkheim showed us that if we try to stop all 100 ringleaders, that we can stop 32 of them. And again, before, during, and after full implementation, if a woman gets raped, she's 0% responsible for her own rape. Now, I have an asterisk in the penultimate sentence of the above paragraph. I'm going to read it again and then jump right down to its corresponding asterisk. Durkheim showed us that if we try to stop all 100 ringleaders, that we can stop 32 of them. In this sentence, it may sound like I'm trying to say that it's 1 ringleader per rapist and that it's 1 rapist per rape, which is not the case. Let me explain. With suicide, it's 1 completed act per person. With rape, it's many ringleaders contribute to the creation of each rapist, and then each rapist may very well go on to rape more than once and or more than 1 person. The problem I'm trying to avoid here is one of syntax. Sure, Durkheim showed us how we can stop those ringleaders from talking those 32 potentially suicidal people into committing suicide. Durkheim showed us a method how we can do that. Well, he also did more than that. I think Durkheim's method can also be used to stop 32 potential rapists from ever being talked into raping, even once. To be clear then, this series is not about blaming women for their own rapes. It's about stopping ringleaders from talking potential rapists into becoming rapists. Sure, 68 out of every 100 rapists are probably going to rape anyway, but 32 potential rapists who have never raped will reach their deathbeds still having never raped if the tune whistled from the lips of the ringleaders changes. And what is that tune? Often, it sounds like a shaken set of keys. More, plenty more, in my appendix for this one. Anyway, Durkheim didn't stop with these 32 surplus suicides. Another swath was also ripe for the plucking, and we can begin harvesting next time. That one's called Part 17, or Drastic Economic Changes.